Hope everyone is having a great day. Today, as we began discussing our lesson, we talked about how the pen, or in some ways, the camera, is more powerful than the sword. And why is that? Well, you may have indicated that's because they have the power to shift certain public opinion in ways that wars can't. And that's certainly true. And that's certainly a strategy to some degree the Islamic State has been using in terms with using Twitter, that they've been trying to get people to their cause not because of what they've done, but because of what they say and how they portray that. Just a heads up, I'm going to show you a couple of photographs throughout this lesson that will indicate such. These will be powerful photographs that have really shifted public opinion. And so for all you photographers out there and artists and people that like to use what you create to influence people, realize that this is an example of ways that can be done and has been done in the past. The biggest power that the media has is the power to shift public opinion. And a couple things we need to realize before we jump into how the media does this. But the first that we need to realize is that any event that is told both in newspaper and print or Facebook, whatever you want to call it, is done through a particular set of facts and biases. Everyone has a way in which they view the world, and quite frankly, at some point, that way that they view the world through the particular lens is foggy. There's no question not everyone has all the facts. They only can judge based off what they have. So before we get into the notion to think that the media is unbiased and they don't have an agenda, they just want to report the facts. Sometimes they may just want to report the facts, but they're still only reporting a set of facts that they see. And so there is bias, and there's always, this is something you could apply both to the media and your own life, two sides to the story. With the advent of the 24/7, 24-hour a day, 7-day a week cable news cycle, and with social media even more so, there is a knee-jerk reaction at times to the facts. We saw this clearly, for example, with Ferguson, where it seemed like that Officer Wilson had shot Michael Brown in the back, but when we got the forensics test back, that wasn't the case. So sometimes the media reports just basically of what they get right off the bat without giving time for a story to actually develop. That happens quite a bit, and social media actually aggravates this part. So that's the other thing, is when something comes on the media, sometimes it's best to wait until a story develops before making a judgment call. There are three events in American history that really helped to shape the modern media's role, and they all happened within a time period of about 15 to 20 years. They include the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the Watergate scandal itself. And let's take a look at each of these events and see what they contributed to the media and how the media changed because of those roles and what they do because of it. First was the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement really lasted from, you could argue, 1776 to current day, and I think there is some validity to that. But generally speaking, the Civil Rights Movement is characterized from really 1953, 54 to the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1965. The media was well involved in documenting the numerous protests and riots and abuses that occurred during the Civil Rights Movement. You can see this picture here was taking place during a 1963 Birmingham riot, the same riot that MLK was put in jail for, actually. You could see there was a dog attacking someone. Now, obviously, this picture does not show the fact that there actually were riots, and protests weren't necessarily peaceful, but there were also peaceful protests, and it still showed the fact that the police were able to use brutal force on civil rights activists, many African Americans, namely. And what this did was it actually helped to build empathy in the North. In the North, particularly, that's not to say racism didn't exist; it certainly did. But generally speaking, many of the Jim Crow laws that exist in the South didn't exist in the North, and there wasn't much empathy. But the media coverage of this riot in particular helped to build empathy and helped to galvanize national support for civil rights movement. Otherwise, it would have been a regional movement. And so the first thing the civil rights movement does with the media is it shows that the media has the power to build empathy with people. And it also shows that sometimes the media had an agenda, and in this case, we could argue probably the right agenda, to inform people of what was happening. The second was the Vietnam War. This is where the media portrayed really what the public thought, and that was that the war was pointless and was unwinnable or was defeated. And they continued to report stories in Vietnam that really showed that the war was unwinnable, that it was a lost cause, that we shouldn't be there. And certainly those arguments could be made historically, but the reality is when it came to military strategy and military tactics, the army actually never lost a single battle. And all these stories about the media, what the media was reporting about the news, really actually did affect morale in Vietnam, where soldiers really wondered what they were doing there if people back home weren't even supporting them. There was numerous times when people would come home and they would be spat on actually in the airport if they were wearing a uniform. It makes it really hard to go and fight for any cause if you feel like the people back home hate you. So, to some degree, the media perpetuated what the public thought, but that what the public thought wasn't necessarily based in reality. For example, in 1968, the Tet Offensive was launched by the North Vietnamese Army, um, and it was a massive offensive with attacks all across South Vietnam, insurrection, so to speak, and their goal was to take over key strategic positions. The media really portrayed this as the end of the Republic of Vietnam Army in the United States, or South Vietnam, and they said this is the beginning of the end. This is where the North Vietnamese are going to push into southern Vietnam and officially take it over. But the reality was that the Tet Offensive, although it was arguably the beginning of the end of the Vietnam War, was a failed battle by the North Vietnamese and their allies. But the media reported it as the beginning of the end. This is a picture actually from the Tet Offensive, and this guy about to be assassinated or shot is is a famous picture. It's hard to look at, but the South Vietnamese, if you remember from U.S. history, were really dealing with an insurrection the whole time, and this guy about to be shot was suspected to be a quote-unquote communist. But it also showed the brutality of the South Vietnamese, and that was a problem really from the time South Vietnam was set up. And this created a public outcry of why were you supporting people that do this type of thing. So obviously the numerous attacks the United States Army would do, there was a couple things in there as well. But the Vietnam War really helped show that this sometimes the media portrays what the public wants and not necessarily what's going on the ground. Lastly, the third event was Watergate. The investigations by the Washington Post and New York Times really pushed Congress to launch their own investigations and eventually forced Richard Nixon to have to give up his tapes that would demonstrate that he in fact did have involvement with the break-in at the Watergate complex and really was bringing up dirt as much as he could on people that could possibly prevent him from having power. So it really showed corruption in the Nixon administration. It also set up the time where the media was more likely to be trusted than the government. Because Richard Nixon was a part of the government, everything he came out actually came to be shown as false. People began to trust the media, what the media said, more than the government. But ultimately, between these three events, there's a period of 15 years that set up a time where the media was able to develop empathy in people, affect policy and action in the Vietnam War, and they also created cynicism from what the government says. There's a couple other ways the media influences public opinion today. The first is agenda setting. And this is where they will talk about certain issues going on in the country that force candidates to discuss certain issues. So, in current day, that might be, how do you deal with ISIS? Is racism still an issue in this country? Is immigration an issue in this country? Is college debt an issue in the country. And because the media talks about these, it forces the candidates to come up with platforms and solutions to deal with these problems. It's likely that if the media was not talking about these issues, the candidates would not talk about them. The second is framing. This is when, in some ways, the media focuses on a very small part of a story. In 1999, many of you probably were either very young or not born yet. Um, there was a school shooting in Columbine at Columbine High School in Colorado, and the media focused very heavily on what other students were saying about the two shooters, as opposed to what the shooters revealed about themselves. And we came to find out a couple things that weren't true. There was a story, for example, that these students were a part of something called a trench coat mafia. It was a secret society within the high school, and they were people that liked to wear dark clothing, and they were intent on killing people from the beginning. Well, what we came to find out is actually these two students that perpetrated these shootings were actually very popular. They had a lot of friends. They weren't bullied. That was the other issue. It's not to say that bullying isn't important, and many people in here, I don't want to minimize the effects of that, but Columbine really launched this anti-bullying campaign through the country because the media created this, framed the story that these two students were bullied, and that's why this happened. If we can prevent bullying, we'll prevent school shootings throughout the world. What it really came down to is they were psychopaths, essentially, and you could see the psychological term for that, but they were actually very popular in many ways. They just wanted to hurt people. It's not necessarily right, but the media in some ways created an issue that really wasn't the root problem of preventing school violence. Lastly, the media can prime something, and this is where they can change how the public views a certain candidate or a certain issue. For example, in the aftermath of 9/11, the media favorably reported on George W. Bush. So much so that he has the highest approval rating of any president at any time ever. He also has the lowest. But in the aftermath of 9/11, they just gave stories that put a positive outlook on someone, as opposed to the things that were going on behind the scenes, like No Child Left Behind or the advent of the Patriot Act. In fact, the Patriot Act was barely reported on at the time, and that was because they were priming the public to view George W. Bush in a positive manner. In elections, the media can influence elections in two ways. First off is they can give, say, a candidate has momentum. This is really something that's developed out of thin air, but typically it happens when a candidate does a little bit better in a primary or an election than they originally were intended to do. So, for example, Marco Rubio coming in third in Iowa in the Iowa caucus in 2016. They would say Marco Rubio has momentum. And what they do then is begin to give that candidate more airtime. And next thing you know, they're doing better than they thought. So the momentum idea becomes a little bit more self-fulfilling. There's also the horse race, and this is where they talk about an election being closer than it really is, which actually sometimes makes the election a little bit closer than it really is. So these two things aren't necessarily based in reality, but because the media declares them, momentum in a horse race, they end up giving more support to a particular race or to a particular candidate. And next thing you know, those things are self-fulfilling because the media has the power to develop stories for those individuals that are favorable and that help them get more airtime. So generally speaking, the media can influence the public in multiple ways. They include developing empathy, affecting policy, creating cynicism with the government. They can frame an issue, they can prime an issue. They can also set an agenda for the country depending on what they want to report on. Please check out the conclusion and the rest of this lesson, and let me know if you have any questions.